Admiral Sir Charles John Napier KCB Goat RN was a British naval officer whose 60 years in the Royal Navy included service in the War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars, Syrian War and the Crimean War, and a period commanding the Portuguese Navy in the Liberal Wars. An innovator concerned with the development of iron ships, and an advocate of humane reform in the Royal Navy. He was also active in politics as a Liberal Member of Parliament and was probably the naval officer most widely known to the public in the early Victorian era. Napier was the second son of an also famous father, Captain Charles Napier, RN, and grandson of Francis, 6th Lord Napier. He was thus a direct descendant of the great mathematician John Napier. He was born at Merchiston Hall, near Falkirk, on 6 March 1786, and educated at the Royal High School, in Edinburgh, Scotland. French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. He became a midshipman in 1799 aboard the 16-gun sloop HMS Martin, but left her in May 1800 before she was lost with all hands. He next served aboard Renown, flagship of Sir John Borlase Warren. After this, in November 1802, he transferred to the frigate Greyhound under Captain William Hoste. The following year, he moved to Egyptian for a voyage to St. Helena, escorting a convoy of ships, and then in the English Channel and off the coast of France. In 1804–5 he served briefly on Mediator before moving to HMS Renommée off Boulogne. He was promoted lieutenant on 30 November 1805. He was appointed to Corrigue, and was present in her in the West Indies at the action in which the squadron under Admiral Warren took the French Marengo and Belle-Poule. On 13 March 1806, after returning home with Warren, he returned to the West Indies in HMS St. George, and having been promoted to commander on 30 November 1807, he was appointed acting commander of the brig Pultusk of 16 guns, formerly the French privateer Austerlitz. In August 1808 he became captain of the brig sloop HMS Recruit, and in her fought a hot action off Antigua with the French sloop Diligente, in which his thigh was smashed by a cannonball. In April 1809, Napier took part in the capture of the Caribbean island of Martinique, and subsequently distinguished himself in the Trude's pursuit of 3 escaping French ships of the line, handling the small Recruit so well that the British were able to capture the French flagship Popolt. As a result, he was promoted acting post captain and briefly given the command of the captured 74-gun ship of the line. His rank was confirmed on the 22nd of May 1809, but he was put on half-pay when he came home as temporary captain of the frigate Jason, escorting a convoy. While on half-pay he spent some time at the University of Edinburgh. Napier, still on half-pay, then went to Portugal to visit his 3 cousins. He took part in the Battle of Bucaco, during which he saved his cousin Charles's life and was himself wounded. In 1811, he was appointed captain of the frigate HMS Thames and served in the Mediterranean fleet under Sir Edward Pellew, disrupting enemy shipping. Among his principal exploits was the 1813 capture of the island of Ponza, which was a possible haven for corsairs. In 1813 he moved to command the frigate Euryalus, operating mainly off the French and Spanish Mediterranean coast. American War and the 100 Days. After the surrender of Napoleon and his first period of exile in 1814, Napier and his ship were transferred to the coast of North America, where the War of 1812 with the United States was still in progress, now commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane. In the Chesapeake Bay Campaign, he took part in the August expedition up the Potomac River to Alexandria, arriving several days after the burning of Washington and the Battle of Bladensburg under Maj. Gen. Robert Ross and Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn. He was second in command to Captain James Alexander Gordon. The British squadron took 10 days to travel 50 miles upriver, with many strandings and damage from a tornado thunderstorm. But on the 28th of August 1814, before attempting a bombardment, they captured Fort Washington on the north shoreline, which blew itself up by the Americans before the attack. The town of Alexandria capitulated with a ransom paid and the shipping there was seized. The squadron successfully withdrew downriver with their prizes despite frequent harassing American attacks from the shores downstream. During this withdrawal, Napier was wounded in the neck. He next distinguished himself in the following attack on the city of Baltimore by a British army accompanied by 16 warships, 12 to 14 September 1814. Under Admirals Cochrane and Cockburn, HMS Euryalus was involved in the bombardment of Fort McHenry, protecting the city on the northwest branch of the Patapsco River that began early in the morning of the 13th. At the same time, earlier on the 12th, Gen. Ross had been put ashore to the southeast at North Point with his regiments to attack the town from the east. Unfortunately, he was shot in a brief skirmish just before his troops met the city brigade regiments of the Maryland Militia under Brig. Gen. John Stricker at the Battle of North Point that afternoon. After pausing for the night to tend to the substantial wounded and now under the command of Col. Arthur Brooke, the regiments waited outside the substantial American dug-in fortifications with opposing approx. 20,000 troops and 100 artillery at Old Laudenschlager's Hill until the naval forces were able to subdue the fort and move upriver to attack the eastern land redoubts. The critical period of the attack developed shortly after midnight when a picked British force in longboats armed with scaling ladders under Napier's command penetrated the middle or ferry branch of the river along the southern opposite shore to the west of the fort with the intention of storming it from the rear flank. Before they could land, however, they were detected and subjected to a withering fire from the still active guns of Fort McHenry and two smaller forts to the west, Batteries Covington and Babcock. The British fought back strongly with cannon and rockets. Eventually American firepower prevailed. Napier was compelled to retire to the warships with substantial casualties, and Cochrane's fleet later withdrew on the morning of the 14th, with the Americans raising a substantially huge 42 by 30-foot flag, with the firing of the traditional morning gun at daylight, after the night's driving rainstorm and bombardments, enabling all to see from the town that the fort had held. Euryalus proceeded to Halifax, Nova Scotia for refitting and then took part in the ongoing blockade of the eastern seaboard of the USA. Bored by such duties, Napier issued a challenge to the famous American, Baltimore-built frigate Constellation, which had been lying in on the Elizabeth River harbor near the U.S. Naval Base at Norfolk, Virginia, to come out and fight a single-ship duel. The challenge was accepted and due arrangements were made in the most gentlemanly fashion. But Euryalus was made part of the squadron that Admiral Cochrane took to Florida and Louisiana in December 1814 in the operations that climaxed in the Battle of New Orleans on 8 January 1815, and before she could return to fulfill her engagement with Constellation, news of the peace treaty of Ghent reached the USA. With Napoleon's escape from Elba and brief return to power, Euryalus returned to Britain. Napier's last mission of the Napoleonic Wars was to land troops at the mouth of the River Scheldt to guard against the French advance into Belgium. Marriage and family. At the end of the war, Napier was made a companion of the Bath. He married Frances Elizabeth Ellers, a cutie young husband, generally referred to as Eliza, whom he had known and loved in Edinburgh while still her teenager. In the meantime, Eliza had married a Lieutenant Edward Ellers and been widowed. She had 4 children whom Napier adopted as his own. Of these, the second son, Charles Ellers Napier, became a naval officer. The eldest, Edward Ellers Napier, entered the army, rising to the rank of Major General. He also wrote books of travel and reminiscence, as well as the authoritative biography of his stepfather. Francis also gave Napier 2 children of his own, a son born in Rome and a daughter born by Lake Geneva. The son, Charles, died as a result of an accident aged 5. The first years of his leisure Napier spent in Italy, Switzerland, and in Paris. He had inherited considerable wealth from his mother's side of the family and spent it freely. Steam and iron. During these years Napier began a voluminous and indefatigable correspondence with the Admiralty on the urgency for naval reform, which lasted for the rest of his career. He sought to persuade successive civil administrations of the need for innovative ship design and tactics, the development of steamships and the use of iron in ship construction, the proper training of officers, and decent living conditions for ordinary seamen. He held that the use of the press gang and of flogging should be abolished, and that seamen should receive proper wages and pensions. In all this he was far ahead of his time. His advocacy had little effect. On the contrary, successive administrators considered him an eccentric nuisance. He had been interested in steam navigation since its beginnings, and began investing his considerable resources in a steam vessel service that would ply along the River Seine. In 1821 he financed and participated in the construction of one of the first iron-hulled vessels ever built, and the first designed to venture into open water. The Arran Manby was named after the master of the Horsley Iron Works, Tipton, Staffordshire, where she was prefabricated to a design formulated by Napier, Manby and Manby's son Charles and then assembled at Rotherhithe on the Thames. After trials in May 1822, the Arran Manby crossed the English Channel to Le Havre under Napier's command on 10 June 1822, and proceeded up the Seine to Paris, where she caused a great stir and where she was based for the next decade. This has been claimed as the first passage from France to Britain by steamship, which it was not. But it was the first direct passage from London to Paris by steamship and the first seagoing voyage by an iron ship anywhere. Napier's company built 5 similar steamships, but in 1827 he went bankrupt, leaving the family in severe financial difficulty. Portugal. At the beginning of 1829 he was appointed to command the 42-gun frigate Galatea. The Admiralty gave him permission to fit her with paddles of his own design, worked by winches on the main deck. He carried out trials that proved that ships could travel independently of the wind. The Admiralty, however, did not adopt this innovation. At the start of Portugal's liberal wars in 1832 Napier was at the Azores, which were the only part of Portuguese territory still held for Queen Maria II of Portugal against the usurpation of her uncle, the absolutist Dom Miguel. He so impressed the constitutional leaders, especially the Count of Villaflor, that they begged him to take command of their small fleet. Having unsuccessfully contested the parliamentary by-election for Portsmouth in June 1832 after Galatea was paid off, he accepted their proposals in February 1833, sailing to Portugal with his stepson Charles Ehlers Napier as aide-de-camp, bringing troop reinforcements and using the incognito of Carlos da Ponza. He arrived in Porto, where Queen Maria's father Dom Pedro, ex-emperor of Brazil, and the liberal forces were being besieged by Miguel's armies. He assumed command of the Liberal fleet, succeeding its previous British commander George Rose Sartorius. With the fleet Napier then transported the Liberal army to the Algarve to open a second front in the south of the country. On his return voyage he destroyed the much larger Miguelite fleet in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent on 5 July 1833. These 2 strokes enabled the Liberals to capture Lisbon, which the Miguelites abandoned, though Napier's squadron was now ravaged by cholera. On the demand of France, Napier was struck off the British Navy list. On the other hand, Dom Pedro appointed him Admiral of the Portuguese Navy on 10 July. Napier's victory, with a fleet largely manned by British seamen, was viewed in Britain as a credit to the Royal Navy. The victory and consequent accolades greatly annoyed King William IV, who disliked both Napier and Dom Pedro. Continuing his Portuguese services, Napier commanded land forces in the successful defense of Lisbon, September 1833. For these services he was made Grand Commander of the Tower and Sword, and Count of the Cape of St. Vincent in the Peerage of Portugal. On 12 September 1833 he captured the Lord of the Isles steamer at São Martinho, and in 1836 defended his prize in the Court of Common Pleas. In 1834, with a small army made up largely of British sailors, he reconquered the Minho region for the constitutional cause. After the final defeat of Miguel and the death of Dom Pedro shortly afterwards, Napier found himself frustrated in his attempts to reform the naval administration of Portugal and return to England. His departure was followed by a vote of thanks to him in both houses of the restored Portuguese Parliament. Napier unsuccessfully contested the Portsmouth parliamentary seat for a second time in the by-election of December 1834. He then occupied himself until 1836 with writing a history of the Portuguese War and his own part in it.